So that's the end of our journey from here to Lowell. And again, Estelle and I thank you guys for coming out. Appreciate it. And we love being here. Thanks for coming out, you guys. It means an awful lot. And Howie, thank you for the idea.
Great job.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome.
Anybody have any questions? Because we know a lot. Between me and Brandon, we know 99% of what you need to know.
So if Jack was high school class of 39, what did he not end up in military service?
Jack's military service was very dicey. He basically, like so many men at that time, he was born in 1922, so he was definitely of age. My dad was born in 26, and your dad was born in 26? And so he, those guys got drafted. They were the replacements after
He
D-Day.
didn't wait to be drafted.
He volunteered.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so my dad, dig this, my dad wanted to be a Marine, and they wouldn't guarantee him to him. So he said, I'll wait till I graduate. And then when he graduated, he got inducted into the Army, and then he went into the 82nd Airborne instead. But anyway, the point is, after Pearl Harbor, of course, you had this furor about, how do we fight back? And Jack Kerouac enlisted, legend has it, he enlisted in the Army and the Navy and the Marines all on the same day. Honestly. I know. And the Navy took him, and he went through basic training, and during basic training, he literally throws down his rifle in the dirt and walks to the library. And he says, I can't kill anybody, I'm a pacifist. I can't handle a rifle. So they sent him to Bethesda Naval Hospital and outside of DC, and they evaluated him. If you want a real treat, Google Jack Kerouac, Bethesda, war records, whatever you got to do to find it. But the SmokingGun.com released like hundreds of pages of Jack Kerouac's military record. And his time at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where they evaluated him as a paranoid schizophrenic with masturbatory tendencies. I swear to God, that's exactly what it said. Our kind of guy, right? So, but here's the reason.
That's Jimi Hendrix's story too about getting.
He got out.
Yeah, for that too.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Must have been a condition that they.
They're talking about he broke his ankle when he parachuted, but
that's right. He was in the airborne. I remember that.
I didn't know that. Masturbatory tendencies. Homosexual tendencies,
yeah.
Something like that. Masturbatory, yeah. That's why he did that on purpose to get out of.
Course.
Yeah.
That was smart.
I did not know that Jack Curry did that too. That's
so
amazing.
If you look at the black, in the World War II case, if you look at that large black panel, you see a picture of a ship. And that is the USS Dorchester. Now, some people make fun of Jack Kerouac saying he never served. Jack Kerouac was he was in the Merchant Marines. And he ran numerous shipment convoys between the United States East Coast over to Greenland and to Liverpool, delivering war material through the Lend-Lease program to England from the United States. And, now dig this is an amazing story. We have a display case over there of football. And we talk about Jack Kerouac's time as a football player at Columbia. Because he got pulled out of high school, went to Horace Mann to get groomed for Columbia University, and was playing football until he broke his leg. And that ended his football career, which is why he became a writer. But then after that, his leg healed, and I forget the year, 42 or 43. But he gets a telegram from Lou Little, who was the Columbia coach, saying, I hope you're here all healed up. We need guys, because everybody's all fighting the war. Can you come back to play at Columbia? And Jack got the telegram, and he blew off taking the next run of that ship, the USS Dorchester, to Liverpool, because of that telegram calling him back to Columbia. At sea, a German U-boat caught up to the Dorchester. 675 guys out of 900 died. Jack knew a lot of them. So had Lou Little not sent that telegram to Kerouac, he likely would have perished on that World War II. Yeah, amazing story. Good question, I like that. Anybody else have questions? Seriously. This is a fun time.
Yeah, love it.
Brandon knows a lot. Brandon knows more than I do, but I know a lot. So, nobody's got a question.
So what year did he die?
Jack died in 1969. He was only 42 years old.
Yeah.
Or no, 47 years old.
Very young.
Very young. And he expected to drink himself to death. He was quoted by friends saying, I can't kill myself because I'm Catholic, so I'm going to drink myself to death. Which is what he did.
Wow.
That's what he said was depressive.
Depressive, yeah.
He was very depressive. You can blame it on a lot of things. I mean, alcoholism ran in the family. And
Right.
he got tremendous amount of press as the king of the Beat Generation. And then people started blaming everything on him. If you think about it, 1969 was the height of the Vietnam War. And so Jack was being blamed for all those dirty hippies protesting the Vietnam War.
He just became the symbol.
He was the symbol, and he's saying, what do you mean? I got nothing to do with those people. They said,
Yeah.
yes you do, you wrote that damn book. And that became their Bible. Am I right?
But peripherally, you know what I'm saying, like not, he wasn't attending that.
Well, no, but he wrote On the Road, which influenced all the hippie people. Jack was born in 22, and Alan, who was born in 26, attended the Human Being here in San Francisco
I'm
in
saying
19...
equivocally. Do you think it was unequivocally that they came against him about, because he wasn't like really hippie like that? Like,
Well, Jack was...
He wasn't involved.
He was not... He was
That's
apolitical.
what I'm saying. That's what I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Well, the point, if I understand your question, they were blaming the counterculture on Kerouac's works because the 60s came out of the 50s, basically. The Kerouac and the Beats were born in the 20s, the hippies were born in the 40s. They're a generation later.
That's
So-
what I'm saying.
Yeah, they were a generation
It had nothing
later.
to do with that. And then he's getting blamed for something.
Yes.
And then that makes him depressed, probably.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, he's writing great books.
Yeah.
But like, he's writing classics. When it's like,
Hoover wrote on
It
the
was on the Tales from the
beat
McCarthy era.
thing where they were talking about the beat that he
Howie, I'm sorry, repeat that, Howie.
Hoover wrote on that
Oh, yeah.
ticket over there that the Beats were the enemies of the United
Yeah,
States.
Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover was quoted as saying that the three things wrong with America are beatniks, eggheads, and
Communists,
Com-
eggheads, and beatniks.
communist eggheads. I told you Brandon knows a lot. Somebody else have a point or a question?
It was the McCarthy era that it was.
Yeah, it was the McCarthy era, exactly. And so, and it's the same thing that we're doing. We're living through it again. Obviously, it's how do you get your message? And in essence, Jack's message was compassion, tolerance for others. The thing about the Beat Generation, in my opinion, is every 20-year-old loves the Beats today, whether they know it or not, because the Beats were at the forefront of every social movement of the 50s and the 60s. Whether it's racial equality, gender equality, gay and lesbian rights, even things like climate change. Gary Snyder and Michael McClure writing about saving the whales, saving the dolphins. So everything that a young person who's 20 today believes about what's good in America, what's good in the future in the world, came out of the 50s. Now we're dealing again with the culture wars. When Estelle and I were traveling through Oklahoma, when we were at the Bob Dylan Center, there were a lot of people that came out to see us, and I bet you 1 out of every 5 or 7 people would say, you wouldn't believe what they're doing about banning these books here. They're banning books in the libraries, they're banning them in the schools. We're still fighting the book banning. And as a culture, as a nation, we're dealing with all this stuff. That's why I believe the Beat Generation is so important. Why I love what we do, because we get to tell this message. What's cool is when we get school groups in here, we'll get a group of 20, 30, 40 kids. And if they're from the US, it's always a very mixed, varied group of people. And the thing I like to hit them with early, whether they're 16 or 18 or 20, is if this was the 1950s, you guys would not go to the same schools, you wouldn't live in the same neighborhoods, you wouldn't even know each other, because you'd all be Asian, or you'd all be white, or you'd all be Latino, or you'd all be black. But you would not know each other, you wouldn't hang together, and invariably, this happens more times than I could imagine. A little white girl will grab the hand of her Asian girlfriend, or a black boy will fist bump a white boy. And they'll basically say, I'm glad we're friends. It's amazing to witness this. This is the kind of stuff we've seen here over the years. And, you know, and that's why I've held firmly that tolerance, compassion, authenticity, which is what the Beats were about, is going to win out in the culture wars, because the old people who don't believe in that kind of stuff are still dying off, and the young kids believe in it.
I hope so.
Don't they? They believe in it. The young people believe in it.
Well, it's, you know, youth and optimism. You know.
Exactly, and you reject the values of your parents and all that kind of stuff. I'm enjoying the discussion. Any other questions or points? Dan?
So where does the word beat first show up? Was it Kerouac?
The legend and the lore is that it came from Herbert Huncke, who was a Times Square hustler, and he basically said, I'm beat, and then they started saying, we are a beat generation. The original, this is World War II, this is right at the end of World War II, and John Cleland Holmes talks about this, and he says, you know, we were worn out. It was, society has been collapsing because of the stress of the war effort and everything that's been going on, and we are a beat generation. They were also looking for something that kind of linked to the lost generation, something that would identify a group that could be concise and crisp, like lost generation, beat generation. And so what's very interesting is once he got a little bit of power, publishing cred, because On the Road was so successful, he started consciously changing the meaning of the term beat from tired, worn out, and broken to something more positive like beatific
Yeah.
and beatitude. You know, we are the sympathetic generation, compassionate, tolerant. And I love that because that came from his study of Zen Buddhism. You know, I mean, I don't know how many of you folks read Dharma Bums, but you know, Dharma Bums popularized Zen Buddhism in America and other Eastern religions. The Beats were very well read. Prior to that, oh, you got a copy in your hand, huh? Is that the copy you've had for a long time?
That's the copy I carried around India.
Oh my God.
Traveling in India.
That's amazing. That's a great story. So, so when that book came out in '58, the publishers who loved On the Road said, give us something fast and give it to us. Make it great. And so Jack wrote Dharma Bums quickly about his time on the mountain and knowing Gary Snyder here in Marin and climbing Matterhorn out here. And D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts did a lot for Zen Buddhism. They didn't have a best-selling novel. So in my opinion, alternative spirituality in America came from the Dharma Bums because it was so popular. Prior to that, we were a Judeo-Christian country. Everybody was Protestant or Catholic or Jewish that knew each other. Who knew Muslims in those days in the mainstream, you know? But the Beats were studying Islam, they were studying Hinduism, they were studying Buddhism, and Jack made it popular and fun to be a Zen lunatic with that book. And it changed everything. But it influenced the 60s. All of a sudden, all these hippie kids wanted to be Zen lunatics. So that book from 1958 becomes popular, and in 62, 64, Kesey starts driving the bus in 64, and by 66, you know, the Beatles are taking over everything, and the British invasion. 67, you got the Summer of Love here in San Francisco, and then in 69, you got Woodstock, and that's the history of America. It's the counterculture.
So locally, do any of the universities have a dedicated beat course at the very least?
Well, there are universities in different parts of the country that offer classes on the Beats. I've attended some of them and spoken at some of them. At the moment, I'm not sure if anything...
They do here.
They do certain ones?
Actually, I was just talking to someone about one at State.
Okay.
One at SF State.
I got to tell you a funny story about this. I went to the State one time, and they said, we want you to come in, and this is 7 or 8 years ago. They want me to come in and talk to the students about the Beat generation. And I said, sure. And I go there expecting to find a normal class of 20-year-olds or whatever it would be. Well, this is their after-hours stuff. So I walk into the thing, and there's 50 people in the room, and they're all older than I am. And I look around and I say, well, normally I would talk about this and that, but let me ask a question before we start. How many of you guys attended the Human Being in 1967? And half the hands went up. It was amazing. I said, maybe you can tell me some stuff. That was a fun moment. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, no, so yeah, on to that point, maybe you should like create a list of, if you want to be at least moderately, knowledgeable about the beat generation, these are the 10, 20, 30 books you should read.
It could be 30 books, you're right. It's funny because we get a lot of people in all kinds, and there are hundreds of books written about the beat generation because many of them are in print now. And we carry them because we know our clients love them, so whenever we can find them, we get them. And people donate them to us too. Like, a guy's 80 years old, his kids don't want his books, he gives them to us, which is kind of cool. But I'll never forget one time a kid walks in the door, and I said, "You know about the beat generation?" He goes, yeah, I do. I know everything. I said, "Really? What books have you read?" He goes, "On the Road." I swear to God, really.
Just a start.
I know. No, really. I mean, the big three would be, Howl and Naked Lunch and On the Road. But then you branch out from there, and you got people that love Kerouac like me. You got people that love Burroughs. Other people that really dig Ginsberg, not so much maybe his poetry, but his political activism. That's the thing about Ginsberg. He was extremely politically active. And interestingly enough, we wouldn't have a beat generation were it not for Allen Ginsberg's marketing savvy and acumen. Because he literally went to the other writers and said, "Listen, as a poet, I'm a lone voice in the wilderness. But if I dedicate my poetry books to you guys, and Jack, when you write a novel, you include me and Corso and all these other guys as your characters in the novels, and Ferlinghetti's publish them, we become self-referential. And everybody reads you is going to want to read me, is going to want to read him." And that's played out. It was networking.
That's the Martha Stewart model.
Yeah.
You're talking about one product or the other product.
Yeah, you're right. Yes.
So what was your relationship with Ferlinghetti? Because he's right around the corner. I mean,
Well-
did you know him well? And
No, I didn't know him well. I met Lawrence first. Well, I saw him speak many times, and then I met him finally in 1994, and then we came up here in 2006. But when we were in Monterey, he used to send me stuff all the time. I met him.
Really?
I met him in Big Sur a few times. So Lawrence Ferlinghetti is the reason we built the beat music.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I mean, had I not read his poetry when I was a young man, 14 years old, I'll tell you a funny story. I'm with Lawrence and a couple other friends at an event here in North Beach, and I said, I was 14 years old when an English teacher in the 8th grade, comes in and reads from Coney Island of the Mind, and that really set me on my path. And Lawrence turned to one of his friends and says, "That's when I get all of them. They're all 14 years old when they start reading." And it's true, because that's when you're rebelling. That's when you're trying to find out what is out there. But no, it was Lawrence's poetry that really brought me here. In fact, I'll recite the poem. In 8th grade, me and Danny Rambo were goofing around in the back row of our English class. And Mr. Snyder's up front. And he is reading from some book. And he sees us, goofing off. And he literally takes that book and throws it at us. He'd be crucified today, but in, that year in the 60s or 70s, I guess, 60s. He got away with it. The book crashes against the blinds behind us and drops to the ground. And he goes, "Since you goofballs can't pay attention to that, maybe this one will wake you up." And he recites this by Ferlinghetti. "Sometime during eternity, some guys show up. And one of them shows up real late as a kind of a carpenter from a square type place called Galilee. And he starts wailing and claiming he's hip as to who made heaven and earth, and that the cat who really laid it on us is his dad. And moreover," he adds, "it's all written down in some scroll-type parchment, which you won't even find for a couple thousand years or so, or at least for 1947 of them, to be exact. And even then, nobody really believes them, or me, for that matter. You're hot," they tell him, and they cool him. They stretch him on a tree to cool." And everybody after that, they're always making models of this tree with him hung up. And they're always crooning his name, and they're calling him to come in and sit in on their combo as if he is the king cat who's got to blow, or they can't quite make it. Only he don't come down from his tree. Him just hang there from his tree, looking real petered out and real cool. And also, according to a roundup of the late world news from the usual unreliable sources, real dead. That was my introduction to Ferlinghetti. As a 14-year-old Catholic boy, and it was like, how do you write about the crucifixion of Christ like that? You know, and he's talking about how they hang him from the tree. And he's petered out because of St. Peter. Peter is capitalized. So it really knocked me out. So then I wound up going off to high school and meeting a girl and falling in love. And go off to college and meet another girl and fall in love. And then 2 weeks before we all graduated college, this girl wants to get married. And I said, I'm not getting married now, come on. So she dumps me and marries another guy by the time the semester was done, I swear to God. So I'm licking my chops and trying to get over this heartbreak. And I'm in a bookstore and I'm writing poetry. And I'm looking bookstore because I'm thinking if I'm going to write poetry because I'm so depressed over this love affair, I probably ought to read some poems from other people before I start writing my own poems. So I'm thumbing through the poems in a bookstore and bam, that poem pops off the page. I didn't know who Ferlinghetti was at the time. And I read the book and it knocks me out. And then I go back the next week with another $1, which is all I had. And Allen Ginsberg's Howl was sitting right next to Ferlinghetti's Coney Island of the Mind. And then that led me to Jack Kerouac's scattered poems. I thought all of them were just poets. And I didn't know they knew each other. And then I find a book in a library, Desolation Angels. It's a novel by Jack Kerouac. It's like, oh, that's that poet I read. I didn't know he was a novelist. So I read Desolation Angels as my first novel, which is a combination of Energy of On the Road, Spiritual Quest of Dharma Bums. Desolation Angels is a stunning work. It's one of my favorites.
Good journey.
Thank you. It was a good journey. What
And
brought
you're
us here?
still so young.
Stella was a child bride. Anybody else have questions? Happy to entertain.
One more. So back to Kerouac's Buddhist influence. Do you think that came mostly from Gary Snyder, or maybe through?
Well, the question, you heard the question about where does Jack's Buddhist influence come from? You know, Jack knew a lot about Buddhism before he met Gary. Brandon, you might want to help me out, but when he was down in San Jose at the Cassidy's house, he was studying the Buddhist Bible, I believe, and other works out of San Jose.
Right.
And Gary knows all this stuff. You were talking to Gary earlier, and Gary Singh, and he studied this and did some work on it, I think. But Kerouac was self-studied in Buddhism, which is why he was so enamored of Gary when he met him, and that kind of took it to a new level. Am I getting that correct, Brandon?
Yeah. I mean, Gary represented a person that was willing to take that study, to its logical conclusion.
Yeah. No, I agree.
How you doing?
We showed you a picture earlier. Daniel, anything else on that?
I think Gary Snyder was class of 39 also.
Out of Reed College?
Oh, that college class of 39. So he was older.
Well, Gary was born in 1930. Jack was born in 22.
Oh, younger.
So Gary was 8 years younger.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know what year Gary went to Reed, but I'm correct in that, Brando. I think
Correct.
Gary was born in 30. Jack was 20.
59.
He was considerably younger than
Class of
Class of 59. And that's about the time, well, no, he would have arrived in San Francisco earlier than that, though. I think he said he came here in 54, 55. But Gary was a huge influence. Now, here's an interesting thing for you guys, especially if you know a lot about the Beats. When I first got into the Beats, I thought to myself, God, these guys were best friends. They hung with each other, and they supported each other's works, and they were lifelong friends. And me and my friend Coop and me and my friend Ron, we're going to be lifelong friends. We're going to go live in a commune together and have this great time and friends for life. Gary Snyder blew me away on a tape one time when he was talking to the camera and said, I only knew Jack Kerouac from the fall of 55 until the summer of 56, and I never saw him or spoke to him again. And that blew me away. It was less than a year that these guys had that magnificent experience, and Jack, immortalizes it in Dharma Bums, where basically, and on the road, Neil Cassidy is the guy, you know, that Jack focuses on. In Dharma Bums, it's Gary Snyder. And, you know, that had huge meaning for Jack. French-Canadian Catholic, altar boy in Lowell, studies Buddhism in the early 50s, meets Gary in the mid-50s. He talked about the Four Noble Truths. And those, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I know a little bit about it. And, you know, one of the Noble Truths is, you know, all of life is suffering. And Jack never got to another one of the Noble Truths of Buddhism is you can get beyond the suffering. Jack never got beyond the suffering.
Unless you're depressing.
Yeah. Other questions? I'm enjoying this. So I'm not, if you guys are satisfied, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I'm remembering this, whether it's I saw it on TV or we were with my cousins in Mexico City, but he spent some time in Mexico City.
Jack spent a lot of time in Mexico, yeah. He did a lot of writing there. These guys, you know, they were quite adventurous, you know, and they were, you know, not only driving all over the U.S., but they were driving to Mexico. Burroughs had a farm down in Mexico and cultivating pot. Brandon, you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, part of what brought them to Mexico, and which is also, you know, what brought like Burroughs to Tangiers and stuff, is that in Queer, I believe it is, Burroughs says that everyone in Mexico City seems to have perfected the art of minding his own business. At a time in the 1950s, when everyone was such a busybody in the United States, there was so much pressure to conform and to, you know, you were always kind of looking over your shoulder. In a place like Mexico City, it was so big and so busy that everyone kind of kept to themselves and would tolerate each other so much better than they did in the States. And that's really what brought them there. I mean, yeah, that's the long and short of it, was that, you know, when they were in the Colonia Roma, like over along like Orizaba Street and whatnot,
Right.
that was what took them there. So,
You'd go down there to just simply to be left alone.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Do his thing, yeah.
You know, in the book On the Road, there's this beautiful subplot about Jack and Terry the Mexican girl. And it's about Jack Kerouac on a bus, and he meets this girl Terry, and she's a migrant, a field worker. And he's, you know, on a bus, I guess from San Francisco to LA, and they, you know, cozy up on the bus, and she takes him back to her migrant camp. And she's got a son and other family members, and they have a love affair that lasts a month maybe or more, and finally he goes back to New York. But it's a really sweet story about, you know, a white boy and a Mexican girl in 1950, well, 48 or 59, or 48 to 49, I guess, is when that took place. The real girl's name was B. Franco, and before she died, a friend of ours named Tim Hernandez tracked her down, and she claimed she didn't know that she was featured in Kerouac's book. And it's a beautiful story. One of my favorite lines from On the Road is when Jack decides to go home and leave the migrant camp, because he's working as a field worker himself, a white guy in the fields in 50s, picking cotton, or whatever he's picking.
And he can't hang.
Yeah, he got no game.
That was the point of the story. I don't know if you remember, but Dave Kopp wrote his master's thesis on just that part of On the Road.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and you know, that was the moment in the book where he kind of has this catharsis, where, you know, he's you know, everywhere else he's been kind of a tourist. He's off, you know, for the summer on the road, you know, trying to have adventures and stuff, and it's in experiencing her life, her family's life as migrant workers, the fact that, you know, it's finally time to go out and pick cotton, and when he comes, you know, by the end of the day, his hands are all sore and cut up and bleeding, and his haul of cotton is like this, when everybody else has these big bales of.
Yeah.
Terry's giving him part of her cotton to
part
help
of her
him.
haul so he doesn't look bad. And yeah, that's when he finally realizes, he's like, you know, this is their everyday life, and I'm just kind of like a traveler through it.
Yeah, no, because when I was a kid, we used to pick grapes in Fresno.
Yeah,
you get
that's
paid,
where they were.
You get paid by the tray, so it's
Right.
it's like if you moved faster, you made more money. You know, and if at the end of the day all you got is this, well,
You didn't make any money.
yeah, you don't make it. And
But-
it's just so funny that 20 years earlier, you have, you know, Of Mice and Men,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
that how quickly society changed.
My favorite line from that section of the book is when he finally has to leave. Terry knows he's going to leave, and they say they're going to stay in touch, but he knows that it won't last. And so, because they come from different worlds, and so he's walking away, and this is the exact quote. I'm walking away, I turn at a dozen paces, no, we turn, I turn at a dozen paces, for love is a duel, and I went off to the life that awaited me. And it's such a beautiful moment. And when Walter Sallis was here and he was giving us the card from the movie, I said, how do you reflect that in the movie? I mean, you're not using words. How do you want to reflect that moment? He said, it's all in the eyes. It's just in the eyes, the way they look at each other.
Wow.
I love that section of the book.
Yeah.
Jack got an interesting, you know, we talked about tolerance and compassion, and inclusivity is the word we would use today, but Jack had an interesting affinity, and oh, thank you, Scott, sorry. Had an interesting affinity for all kinds of women. I mean, you know, a lot of Latin women, black women. He had quite a few black girlfriends that people don't know about. We just discovered a new one maybe 2 years ago. And it's fascinating in a time of racial segregation in the 50s, 40s and 50s, that he would have these you know, across the spectrum relationships. It's pretty wild. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm just thinking about the beat being that one word that morphed and changed, and I'm thinking about the woke thing.
Oh, yeah.
And, what do you think about that? Are they sizing everything up to deflect this woke thing?
Well, you know, politically, I mean, it's a shortcut for everything that one side doesn't approve of. You know, I mean, one of the great things about running a beat museum is I can talk about politics and not suffer consequences. I don't lose half of my following or clientele.
They don't care.
Well, they're all on the right side of history, in my opinion. 90% of them.
On the left side.
Yeah, the left side. When I first started the Beat Museum, I was quoted in the Free Republic, if any of you guys remember that right-leaning website. And I was urging people, I was shocked that I did this, but I urged people to vote for Kerry and not Bush.
Yeah.
Because the world's going to fall apart under Bush and Kerry may keep it together. And it makes the Free Republic saying, the guy at the Beat Museum says that, you know, people ought to vote for Kerry. The guy says, what do you expect the beatniks to say, you know? Come on. Who do you think he caters to? Dig.
So I saw so many photographs from this time period, the Gary Snyder photographs, of the peace movement that was going on and constantly held. He constantly covered it, the photographer. I just want to point out that you time-binded with him in that moment, where you had that basically group of do-gooder churchgoers who were the only ones out there, you know, protesting the Korean conflict, protesting nuclear war, and they were the only ones out there, dressed to the nines, of course, you know, in their shirts and jackets and ties.
And there's
yeah, you're time binding with that as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I wear my politics on my sleeves, frankly. And Ferlinghetti, you know, was often photographed at those things, in Berkeley. I mean, I just saw a new photo pop up recently of him in, I forget what year it was, but he's walking the streets, and Maya Angelou was sitting there right next to him. I don't know if you saw that photo, Brandon, but yeah. Maya Angelou and Ferlinghetti in the same photo in the streets of Berkeley protesting. Anybody else? I'm happy to spend all day here, actually. Roger.
So there's been some talk about the etymology behind the word beat and beat generation, and I just wonder, what was the diagnosis from Bethesda again?
Paranoid schizophrenic. With? Masturbatory tendency. You just wanted me to say that
again. Needed to get in a dick joke yet.
Well, folks, if this is it, I really...
Okay, just one last. Speaking of Lawrence, that Nagasaki teacup, the one that he picked up when he walked through Nagasaki, did you ever visit his home? I never did. On Francisco, did you ever?
I visited it, but a lot of stuff had been packed away, and I never saw that.
Oh,
wish
it's
I could
after
have
he
seen it.
died.
What she's referencing is, Lawrence was in World War II. He was a sub-chaser commander in 1944, and he was at D-Day when we stormed the beaches in a support role. And then at the end of the war, he was in the Pacific, and 4 weeks after we dropped the atomic bomb, he toured either Nagasaki or
It was
Hiroshima.
6 weeks.
6 weeks?
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if it's
Nagasaki.
Nagasaki.
Yeah.
It was one of the nuclear cities.
Yeah.
And as he's walking amidst all this destruction, he finds this teacup laying on the ground, shattered, and he picks it up, and as he picks up this little teacup, he finds a piece of a finger fused to the teacup. Someone had been drinking their morning tea when the bomb hit, and their finger was forever fused. Nadia mentioned that she thought Lawrence brought that back and still had it. It's just a hell of a story, because he says basically that's the moment he became a pacifist. He said nothing in the world is worth this level of destruction.
Right. Peter Maravellis at City Lights
Told
told
you
that
that.
story. And a
Well,
lot
he would know.
of, some of the obituaries mentioned that he walked through Nagasaki after he died, but none mentioned the teacup, and it sat on his mantle in his home for 75 and a half years until he died. So that was his
Reminder.
Reminder, don't
turning
do
point of his
that.
life.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Note
Yeah.
to self, yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
One thing Ferlinghetti said, and something I read on the internet, was that an interviewer said, you know, what was it like being part of the beat movement? And he said, I wasn't. I'm too old. I'm a full generation older than all those
Yeah, he
guys.
was in the beat.
And more than that, he said, I was a businessman. I published the beats. The beats were rifling my cash register at night. but I wasn't a beat. He was not the right age, and he was a businessman. He was a publisher.
And he said he was home minding the store.
Yeah, and he considered
And he
himself.
didn't abuse drugs or alcohol.
That's right.
He made a point of that.
He was very kind.
And he but identified, I think, more with bohemians than he did with beats.
Yeah.
He did.
But he blessed Allen Ginsberg to his dying day, because there wouldn't be a City Lights if it weren't for Allen Ginsberg's Howl. They sold a lot of copies of Howl.
Indeed.
Well, this has been a joy. It really has.
thank you
Thank you,
so
guys.
much.
We still got some munchies and some refreshments. So thanks to everybody for coming out. Truly appreciate it.